Again, welcome everyone. My name is MK Bozen. I'm with K Strategies. You've heard from me several times throughout this process of planning the master plan for Hensley Field. So again, I want to welcome all of you from our technical advisory group. Today, we're going to be collecting your comments for the draft master plan. And to get us started, I'm going to pass it over to Arturo Del Castillo, and he's going to introduce a couple of housekeeping items as well.
Great. Thank you, MK, and welcome everybody again. Can you fast forward to the next slide, please, MK? We want to thank you again for your input throughout this whole process. You might remember that we started this with you back in November of 2020 with an initial kickoff meeting. We came back and presented a draft of the guiding principles in February of 2021. A scenario evaluations in June of 2021 and presented a preferred alternative in July of 2021. So since then, there's been a lot of work, 6 or 8 months worth of developing that final master plan. And today will be our 5th time with you all. And we'll be reviewing the recommendations of the draft plan before its public release in March 11th. So hopefully you've had a chance to go through the draft document and look closely at the sections most closely associated with your department or area of expertise and influence. We want to hear from you today on the draft and whether you think it's consistent with the policies of your agency or department. Do you see anything that should be modified? Are there any inaccuracies or misrepresentations that should be addressed in the document? Are there any concerns you may have with implementing the plan? And is the plan effectively addressing the overall mission and 6 guiding principles of the master plan? Next slide, please. So as a reminder, the project's mission statement has been focused on leveraging the value of the city-owned asset to create an implementable plan, achieving community objectives related to social equity, economic vitality, and environmental stewardship. Next slide, please. So the 6 guiding principles and their corresponding goals are the foundational framework around which the master plan has taken shape. These principles have helped guide us through the development of the master plan process from its inception and can be used as benchmarks to measure the project's ultimate success. I think starting with the next slide, I'm going to hand it off to Jim.
Hey everybody, my name is Jim Adams with McCann Adams Studio, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the plan before we go into each of the recommendations. Next slide. So the plan that's emerged is one that we have taken basically with the input from both your group, the technical advisory group, and the stakeholder advisory group. We have tried to adhere to the principles that were established for the plan. What has emerged is a plan that is a walkable mixed-use community with about 3.7 million square feet of commercial or institutional non-residential uses and 6,800 residential homes. An interconnected network of open space comprised about 185 acres or about 25% of the overall site. The plan has really tried to create a strong orientation to Mountain Creek Lake with trails, a new marina, and water-oriented recreational uses. Leah Hales will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Historic preservation, adaptive reuse of some of the key existing buildings, as well as some of the artifacts and features of the site are highlighted. Jeremy Klopp from Fair and Pierce will talk about the multimodal transportation system of the plan. Gail Vittori will talk about our environmental goals and our objective to achieve the goals of the climate action plan with net zero construction, the maximization of renewable energy sources, and then creating a diversity of housing choices in a mixed income community. We have developed a program in conjunction with the housing department of the city that will ensure that at least 20% of all homes will have long-term affordability for qualified applicants. Next slide. And just some of the images that you may have seen in the master plan. The project will include a high-capacity transit spine through the center of it that will be able to support BRT, bus rapid transit, or even light rail transit should the ridership should the densities achieve the ridership objectives for DART. Next slide. The whole open space system, every home will be within a 5-minute walk of a park or open space, and many of the open spaces include blue-green infrastructure. What we are exploring and will continue to explore through the implementation phase is the restoration of the original alignment of Cottonwood Creek through the site. We believe this is important from a water quality standpoint. It also enhances the overall amenity of Mountain Creek Lake. And we are proposing to create what we've called the Innovation Village on the 40-acre runway peninsula that projects into Mountain Creek Lake as a demonstration project for sustainable development. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to organize this meeting into 5 sections where we'll go through the recommendations of the plan under each of these areas. Jana McCann is going to start out and talk about the land use, economic development, and affordability and diversity recommendations of the plan.
Hi, everybody. First, I just want to orient you to the slide itself and what directions are where. So at the top, and maybe MK can help point things out with the cursor, is Jefferson Street or just Jefferson at the very north edge of the site. And as you'll see in the recommendation, the first recommendation, that is where we're orienting, see all those purple parcels, which represents a potential for corporate and institutional users. Throughout this whole process, we've talked a lot about attracting a catalyst user to the site early on. So we imagine that that catalyst user will want that sort of high visibility and easy access from the major arterial roadway there. So again, that's all that purple zone. And second, we've really been having a lot of discussions about incorporating a film studio complex on several of those 2 parcels farther to the east, which you'll see up in the northeast, in the purple. Sorry. Okay, we've got the bad east-west directions going. But anyway, the third big recommendation is that 30 to 40% of the houses at Hensley Field need to be targeted for low to medium density for sale or fee ownership. And so, yeah, you see a lot of those in the light yellow and some in the orange. And then a program of mixed income housing will be incorporated, and that will be really informed by the City of Dallas's housing department, who we've been working very closely with to establish these guidelines. And so one key thing too, to really incorporate housing is and this is number 5, to accelerate the relocation of the Texas Army National Guard, which is in the southwest. There you go, MK, corner of the site, where you see also that little blue square up near the Cottonwood Creek area. That is the location of a lot of still military related activities with the reservists, and that can be create incompatible use with future housing. You can go to the next. So this is that plan kind of laid out so that you see, again, East Jefferson Street at the top. And you'll see the sort of 4 big areas along the north, starting from the left or the west, is the development of a market district, which would include what we've heard about from really day one, the interest in a full service, high quality grocery store that could serve this whole area. And then what we're sort of deeming the West Campus, all you see in the blue there for anchor uses. And then on the East Campus, that's probably got the highest potential for a film studio because of all those existing warehouses that you see depicted those boxes that are numbered 7 to reuse those existing big hangars that can be ideal for film production uses. You see a little green spot, number 8, that's where the original entrance into the site was, and the historic officers' houses are still located there originally from the 1930s. And then you see a purple zone that's titled United States Air Force, and that's still a pretty big zone and leasehold that will continue to go on until about 2039. And so at which point then we can start to introduce new uses in that area. Go to the next. So we have quite a few strong urban design principles that are guiding how we've laid this whole project out, and also that would continue to guide the development, implementation of the master plan. And first and maybe foremost really is that connection to nature and respect for the water and clean water, clean air, access to trails and parks, open spaces. Then compact and walkable districts and neighborhoods, which Jeremy will talk more to, but really creating block sizes that are small enough to where you create a lot of, it's very easy to walk from one place to another and have what we like to call high density of different connections. Then very important is to tone down the dominance of the automobile. We do that through the design of the streets, but also through the design of individual building sites so that we don't have huge parking garages, for example, facing the public space and the public streets and urban realm. Then having, and Gail Vittori will talk more about this, a really resilient architecture of high quality, highest levels of green building, and then livable and compatible density. So that's really speaking to a spectrum of different levels of density that can compose a really great neighborhood. And then finally, an active and engaging public realm, which we'll see in a bit as well. So in terms of that housing, we're really wanting to create a full spectrum of what's been deemed, and I think we've talked a lot with this group about it, missing middle homes. So giving a variety of different types of housing at different scales and different price points. So it's not just a development where there's some detached single family homes, and then at the other end of the spectrum is the big multifamily or apartment buildings, but there's just a broad sort of range of all those in between housing types. 20% of all of these homes would be affordable, which is consistent with City of Dallas housing policies. For sale housing would need to hit 80% for people who make 80% or below of the average median income. And for rental, it would be people who would be making 60% of that level. Affordable homes would be completely and seamlessly distributed throughout all of the housing areas and neighborhoods of the project and be indistinguishable from those market rate homes. So we've got some great tools to really help implement the affordability aspects, one of which is a community land trust, and then having the master developer and sub-developers actually cross-subsidizing the housing. And then with the use of low-income housing tax credits, we can attract those, or the individual site developers would be competing for those tax credits to help tremendously with the financing. So in terms of the balance between for sale homes and rental homes, we'd like to achieve a balance of between 40 to 60%. Either way, between those two, it's been sort of found that creates sort of a healthy balance of tenants versus homeowners. You can have next. And so this image and perspective is really trying to convey that idea of that spectrum of housing choices where you see a lot of different heights or densities and scale of housing, but they all really work together and are compatible. So there's not like a radical change from one moment, one street to the next in terms of height or density. But they're all really trying to achieve a very high quality of building. So in terms of the land use and economic development, affordability and diversity, all of those things packed into one question. Here are the Mentimeter questions that Arturo went over with you all. So we're anxious to see your voting on all of this.
So you are all familiar with Mentimeter. We've used it before. What I'm going to do is put a link in the chat that will take you directly to this question, and you can follow along there. But what we're looking for on this first question here is kind of a scale. How are we doing on each of these questions? We've got, are the recommendations consistent? Should they be modified? Are there any misstatements? And so on and so forth. And we're asking your opinion. Are we way off the mark on these items? Or is it great you have no recommended changes? Just kind of tell us via scale where we're falling. You will have opportunity to give particular specific comments on the next slide. So don't be wary there. If you're having issues connecting, again, we have the link in the chat, or if you're on your mobile phone, we have a code at the top of the screen. You'll go to menti.com and use the code that's at the top. Perfect. It looks like we have our first couple of submissions in here already. You can see those numbers bouncing around. Again, these are showing the average scores of the submissions completed.
And is that from a 1 to 5, MK?
0 to 5. So 0 would be
I
way
see.
off the mark. 5 would be this is perfect, no changes. It's good to see that you guys are agreeing. You might have some suggestions, but we're doing all right so far. Someone is saying they have access denied. Can you talk us through your issue and we can troubleshoot with you?
When I click on the link, it just pops up Mentimeter access denied.
Interesting. I haven't had that issue before. Sarah, have you had that before?
I think it's because the computer automatically uses Internet Explorer and it's not set up for.
David, you could also try your phone, just going to menti.com, and then you could put in that 8-digit code that's at the top of the slide, 36174394. So then you can use whichever browser you'd like.
Okay, thank you.
If it's helpful, I can put a QR code on the screen, and that will allow you to just scan it real quickly. I see Amy's put in the chat, she's having the same issue. All right, if you've got that, I'm going to take down the voting instructions and go back. Looks like we've got 23 people voting. I'll give just a few more minutes, and then we're happy to hear your comments more specifically. All right, let's go on ahead and hear some of those specific comments. So this is open-ended. Tell us what specifically would you change or would you make edits to related to this section that we've just talked about. And feel free to come off mute if you have an open discussion that you want to get started as well.
Hi, this is David Noguera. I really like how far you've come since the last time I sat in on these discussions. So kudos to you, and thank you for taking that feedback and you incorporating it into your plan. Couple things I just wanted to share is that I want to make sure that the affordability that you described in the plan is not reliant upon the tools that you listed, right? It's fine to use low-income housing tax credits. What we found in Dallas, it's a very political tool, and it doesn't matter how good intended the project may be. If it's attached to that name, it can be problematic. The other thing is we have a policy on community land trusts, but we don't actually have any community land trusts here in Dallas. And you know, I've heard folks talk about establishing one. but we'll see if we actually get to that. So one of the things that I think we could do, whether we use CLTs, tax credits, or some other product, is naturally occurring affordable housing, right? And I like the mixture of products that you displayed in that previous slide. I just want to make sure that as this plan is implemented, the developers who are selected to carry out the housing have those designs and expectations included in their contracts, so that we don't end up with more homogeneous products, right? Because I'm constantly arguing with the builders who are telling me, oh, it's too expensive to have that many different floor plans. Oh, we can't make the numbers work, right? I've seen it work in lots of cities. It just really comes down to, is there the will to do it, right? So you guys laid out what that vision looks like. I just want to make sure that wherever this plan goes, whatever developers end up working on that housing component, have it included in their plan, so it's not dependent on a tool that may not be available, or may be so politically charged that it's not viable.
Thank you, David. I think one of the things that we're going to, that we've suggested is that the master developer and the city of Dallas will enter into a master development agreement that will put these requirements in place. So the developer will be on the hook to ensure that, these affordable targets are met. And there will be an incentive to do affordable by design as well, just to meet these requirements. So, but you bring up very good points. Whether a community land trust is implemented or not, we think that's one tool that would certainly ensure long-term affordability. But that, we'll have to see as whether the master developer chooses that as one of the tools to use to achieve the 20%.
But I think also it's interesting, David, what you bring up about wanting that sort of diversity of the look of the housing as well. And that's something that, again, I think the master developer and the city of Dallas can have some control over, in terms of like not letting out, 300 lots to be developed by the same developer. And so we had a great experience with Miller where it was extremely varied, where no one builder had large areas to develop. And so that allowed for a lot more diversity and look and feel in the neighborhood, with as little as, I think the smallest developer did 6 lots. So it was a whole different scale, and it's really made a huge difference in the look and feel of the place.
Great. I see a bunch of other comments here on the screen. Does anybody want to amplify on any of these questions?
One person's asking about the film studio idea, which actually has been talked about from the very beginning of the project. And we have actually had some interviews and with film studio folks, and tried to understand what the parameters and what their needs are going to be within a space like this, and with the types of buildings that are potentially that we have existing within those hangars. So it is something that we feel like has some legs, but it's certainly a long way to go to get it there. I don't know if there's any,
I see
representative.
Yeah, there's a question here about they'd like to see the film studio section larger footprint. I think important here is that the city and the master developer will need to negotiate with the any kind of film entity that comes to the site. So the footprint could be larger. It could end up being smaller as well. So what we're seeing on our plan is an illustration of a possible mix of uses, but yet there is some flexibility as to exactly what will happen there, what the economics will be of the film studio as well. Has the education space been discussed or vetted with DISD? This is actually Grand Prairie Independent School District, and we have met with them. They have not yet determined what type of school this will be, but they have said that it definitely, there would need to be a school here. And so we've targeted a 10-acre site and an additional 8 acres of open space adjacent to that site. And anybody who wants to talk specifically about that, please unmute yourself and we could expand on that.
So MK, could you scroll up a bit for that question about, will one office be the champion of these goals? Or will sections be divided up in advance? I think that's a good question if I understand it. One office from the city, and maybe Arturo, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah.
Or Jim?
I think the plan has said that certainly planning and urban design is going to continue to play a key role. I think the idea was that Office of Economic Development would be issuing a solicitation for a master developer ultimately, but Arturo, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little too early to know for sure how the city will want to move this forward, or who will be the one quarterback leading the effort. I know a lot of offices will be involved, and I do understand the sort of the importance and the need for having everything come through one entity, and maybe that's an entity that we don't have yet. I know the Office of Economic Development has created a new group, and maybe that's where it starts. So there's still some conversations that need to be had regarding that, but certainly those are things that we're thinking about already.
Any other questions that people want to bring up before we move into the next section, which is open space?
I'd also like to add that just because we don't answer your question does not mean your feedback won't be incorporated into our next set of revisions. That's why we're taking all of these comments and archiving them. So just if you don't get a chance to speak, please make sure you're typing in the questions here.
So yeah,
we can archive it.
I noticed here some questions about the surrounding land uses and the concern that some of those land uses may make it difficult to attract a grocery store, for instance, or have we? So we are very conscious of those uses. We are trying to create appropriate transitions. You'll notice that we've created a forest, or I think Leah's going to talk about that, along the edge of the Dallas Global Industrial Center. We've put the grocery store in a location we think will be most competitive at the corner of Baghdad and Jefferson. Again, there is flexibility in the ultimate plan if there turns out to be a site that might be more advantageous. But having our experience working with these major chains, we think that's probably the best location on this site for a major grocery store, because serving the surrounding area as well as the new development. Okay, let's move on to open space public facilities. And Leah Hales, SWA, is going to lead this section.
Hey everyone. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about our open space and public areas and historical areas of the site. So based upon the recommendations that came out of the master plan evaluation report and in meeting with all of you, we've determined to reserve at least 25% of the site for publicly accessible open space. That's about 185 acres. I think that's a really great number for this piece of property, especially with the densities that it's showing on here. We've reserved 10 acres of the site for a GPIC public school and located it adjacent to a 10-acre site for a playfield area. And we will show you a little bit more of that on the next slide, but it's kind of centrally located within the site. We'll coordinate with the Office of Environmental Quality on risk and rewards of opening up Cottonwood Creek. We find that there's a lot of reward in opening up the realignment of the creek, both for the health of the ecosystem and the water quality itself, but also creating additional waterfront for the project, especially within the central core of the project. Integrating blue-green infrastructure in part of the open space. This is rainwater capture, cleaning, and filtration, really relying more on that green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure for the property when it comes to stormwater systems. Ensure that every resident's within 5-minute walk of a public open space. So this is exceeding the Trust for Public Lands 10-minute walk to open space. We're striving for that 5-minute walk, and we think that's completely achievable on this project. And then negotiating with the U.S. Air Force for reconfiguration of its boundaries. This really has to do with that easternmost pond and landscape area. There's just a portion of that site that is, or maybe all of that piece of it is fenced in, separate from the site to the west of it. So I don't think that'll be a huge issue for the city of Dallas to renegotiate that. It'll just give a little bit better experiential treatment as you enter into the project. Okay, next slide. So these are the open space and public facility areas shown here. So as I mentioned to you, right in the center of the site, number 1 is where we're showing a future GPISD school. And this would contain both like a shared track with the infill being a kind of a junior high sized soccer field. We also are showing tennis courts and other kind of public and school use facilities. So during the school day, obviously this would be all closed off, but then in the evenings and weekends, this could be opened up to the community to utilize as publicly accessible open space, which is something the city of Dallas is doing with a lot of their schools these days, is opening up as public parks in the evening hours. Reuse of the existing World War II hangar, and we'll show you some ideas about that. Reuse number 3 there, that's the existing Readiness Center, which is currently occupied by the Texas Air National Guard. And it's a building in a pretty good condition. So once their lease is up and they, potentially move on, that might be a great space for a community center. We are showing up near where we're showing the grocery store, there would be a new fire EMS station, along with the urban farm is immediately south of that, with our community-wide composting center, which is, these are all things that are part of a resilient site, plus part of kind of the climate action plan and how to integrate a lot of those elements. The existing officers housing we've talked about, that might become a welcome or sales center. The innovation village down below, that's going to be part of the research and teaching people about this, about sustainability. The film center, which we've already mentioned, but there may be a public accessible part of that. And then the other community-oriented facilities would be like outdoor markets, places, plaza spaces for events, things like that. Next. So this is just showing you one image of that blue-green infrastructure. And essentially, this is a way to integrate our stormwater management and cleaning of the water within the linear park systems. So there's trails that are in there, there's playgrounds, there's maybe little urban community gardens, things like that, that are all a part of those linear park systems, but they also are functioning within that space. This is in one of the residential zones. And then this plan here, this is really just talking about different park typologies that happen throughout the master plan. So this park is kind of in the more urban district. This is where we would have our catalyst user location, but it might be a central park for, both workers to come out to and also, or I guess employees, and also for the the residents as well, but a little more urban scale, urban design to those public open spaces. And then this is our kind of waterfront marina park area, showing it adjacent to the retail, but really, having access on the water. This would be where the Cottonwood Channel reconnection happens. Just sort of showing and integrating kind of that waterfront feel. And, this could really be a game changer for the city of Dallas, this areas like these. Next. So the historic preservation and adaptive reuse, there are several, obviously this is a historic site. It's changed over time, but it's been basically a military site for 60, 80 years, maybe, long time. So maybe even close to 100 now, but anyway, preserving the history of Hensley Field for future residents. So we're showing here, the preservation of the officers' housing, the cemetery, the main maintenance hangar from the World War II, the water tower, small arms magazines, plus there's multiple other things, and prioritizing how these adaptive reuses will, what they're going to be used for and how they take place, and really working with Historic Preservation Office to develop a strategy for protection and reuse of these existing structures. Next. In addition to that, we have incorporated a historic trail system. This is about a 5-mile trail, just the outer loop itself. It's not all of the trails on site. This is one of the trails. But really, kind of having this trail system where people can, walk from these places and experience these different pieces of history and have interpretive signage and things like that, really explaining like what this site was before. Next. So this is a concept rendering here that we've done for the maintenance hangar. This is the World War II one. We know that this structure would need a lot of work, but we think that it could be utilized in a way that would really be a great public facility here. It could be cultural or event space. It might have a beer garden. It might change functions over time. We're kind of showing it with this sort of, beer garden atmosphere outside, but it could be for any kind of community event center, things like that. Open air concert place. I think there's multiple opportunities of things that can happen here, and we've got some ideas about that that we're going to share further. Next. So open space and public facilities, historic preservation, adaptive reuse. Did I say this, MK, or is this you?
A bit of both. So these are the same questions that you had in the last section, but just this time focused around open space, historic preservation, adaptive reuse. Again, we're looking for where on this scale do you see that we're fitting? Are we way off the mark? Are we getting pretty close? Is it perfect? Let us know here, and then we'll open it up for comments. Does anyone have a question they want to open it up while we're taking these votes?
Let's see. There's, I guess, the lowest scoring thing. It's the concern about whether these recommendations could be successfully implemented. Does anybody want to talk about that?
Jim, there's a question in the chat about the expected population of the site. I know that we wrote that in the report. Would you like to tell them that?
It's, well, with 6,800 homes, we're estimating the population would be 12,000 residents, could be a little more. And then with 3.7 million square feet of commercial or institutional space, that could be another 12,000 jobs. So, so a good handle would be 12,000 people, 12,000 residents, 12,000 employees.
This is Jared White in the Park Department of the City of Dallas. So I can address the question as to why that one about implementation was low, and I'll tell you what my thought was. It all just comes down to operation and maintenance. That's what I was looking at. You know, it's a lot of park space. You know, we want to have a high level of design, but you know, who's going to be maintaining that? You know, the site is fairly isolated, and just due to its orientation, is kind of far from our existing maintenance facilities. So would we need to have maintenance facilities on site somewhere, so we're not, if the city of Dallas is maintaining all of this, driving across town just to try to get out here? So that's just some of the things I was thinking about. Maybe not, can't be addressed during this call, but it just always comes down to O&M.
All right.
Thanks, Jared. And I'll expand upon that. This is something that, you know, SWA certainly is paying attention to more and more these days, is about maintenance and long-term sustainability of projects. But also, I think as this project develops over time, which, you know, we still have a ways to go, you might have community resources that start to be developed, like similar to an HOA or things like that, that might go into this that would help maintain, or those public-private partnerships like we have with the Katy Trail and things downtown. So I think there's opportunities for those types of things to happen. It might not happen immediately, but these parks will also be phased over the process of the project. They will come in the 3 phases as the project's developed.
But I think also what Leah said about Property Owners Association, because of the extent of the open space, we certainly wouldn't expect the Parks and Recreation Department to be responsible for all of that. Based on our experience here in Austin with the Miller development, I think you would have a significant amount of the open space being maintained by the Property Owners Association, which would be both the residents as well as the commercial entities.
This is Carla. It's actually Windsor. It's still popping up as Weaver with the Council of Governments. I was just going to mention, I dropped in the chat, as this project wraps up and goes towards adoption, we have a regional trails map at the COG, and this area doesn't really show any trail activity. So the city would want to update that in their trails master plan and make sure that's added to the regional map, because that's how we prioritize funding for trail projects. So you'd want to get that one on the radar. And then we have the regional VeloWeb, which is just to the east of the site, which ties you into other cities. So you may want to think about that and how your trail system will link over to that larger system of interconnected trails. So I added the link to our website. It's an interactive map that shows you different layers of where all of the city trail plans are currently located and adopted in our long range plan.
And we did use this website when we were doing our trail section of this project. It's both in section 2.7, where it talks about adjacent parks and trail systems. Good. And then I believe it's mentioned again in the, maybe in the transportation section. But yes, we have been paying close attention to how we can connect up to the VeloWeb.
Excellent. And then Jared, on your comment about the maintenance and operations, how do y'all currently handle Lucy Billings' development over at Cypress Waters, which is technically within the city of Dallas, but nowhere near the city of Dallas? How is that trail system that she's developing around the lake currently operating? Or TBD?
I think that's TBD. I think some of it right now is privately maintained, but you know, we're working on that project out there now. That's to go to construction. My understanding is that park staff will have to maintain that. I think they'll just have to drive out there to do it. You know, we don't have the nearby facility because it's so far out of town.
Okay.
Actually, this is Chris Turner Noteware in the park department. And we actually are developing an agreement with Ms. Billingsley and their development, and they will be maintaining those facilities out there. That's part of the agreement.
Excellent.
There's a question about maintenance costs being transferred to the homeowners. Will this add a hurdle for lower income residents to be incentivized to be able to afford to live in the area? Yeah, I think that's something that we certainly would need to look at more carefully. Again, the experience here in Austin has a pretty robust affordability program and also a fairly generous open space maintenance thing. We've been able to make it work here, but it'll all boil down to the numbers in the end. So a question about former military facilities and contaminants, lead-based paints. I know Lori Trilson, I saw her name is here. We're working very closely with the Navy, the city is, on the cleanup of the site. Most of those types of contaminants that you're mentioning here, the PCBs, lead-based paints, metals, have already been cleared by TCQ. The one contaminant that is still being studied is PFAS, polyfluoroalkyl substances, and the Navy is about to come out with a feasibility strategy for cleaning those up. But that's the one contaminant that still remains on the site.
Jim, would you like me to?
Yes, could you thank you, Lori.
When I hear about lead-based paint, I think about the structures. So I can say that the officers' quarters did have some abatement previously by the Navy, but there will be, when those go to be reused, there will be a need for that to be reassessed and there to be some potential abatement, because at the time they only abated a certain portion of it. There wasn't damage or need at that time. So I will point that out. And then the PCBs piece, we don't have a PCBs impact on the property. That is not a contaminant of concern that is on the land currently.
And I'll just add that we did early on in this project have a building assessment done, cost assessment for each building that might potentially be reused and what the costs associated with that might be.
Yeah, and that's built into the economics of the project.
Yeah, and then Susan had a thing about I guess the contaminants in the soils. We are paying attention to that. The soils have been cleared, but we are also, when we put our agriculture location on the site, we went into an area that had no known contaminants within it. So,
and I'll just also add, prior to redevelopment out there, if there's an area, I know guidance that we've given, if there's an area that would need some additional assessment, I think that would be done prior to some type of redevelopment. But like Leah's saying, there's a lot of data out there already for the property, but we often recommend some additional testing if needed, if they're seeing gaps, that should be done prior to any redevelopment.
Leah, it's Murray Miller, Office of Historic Preservation. As noted in some of our previous discussions, I've emphasized the importance of the master planning being informed by the historical significance and integrity of Hensley Field. I just wanted to underscore that this does extend well beyond structures, individual structures. The statement of significance was developed very deep into the master planning process. And as a result, it's possible that it might not be able to play the role that it should or could. We are at a stage where the master planning process that has a great momentum, and it appears to be achieving many interdisciplinary objectives. We do have observations, questions, and a need for clarification of the statement of significance in order to better understand the effectiveness of its role in the master planning process. At this point, we're still looking for the connection, which we're happy to elaborate more on after the statement of significance has been expounded upon and clarified.
okay, and I know that there's a statement of significance has been developed. Have you received that?
Yes, I have, and I have a number of questions and seeking clarification in order to basically say yes, that we're concurrent with the analysis. So I've made a note of some of the observations and questions and clarifications that we think that we need. But again, I'm as an observation, this is very deep into the master planning process. Typically, a statement of significance would have been well, I guess, well developed well before the master planning process has gotten to this stage. And it may not be anything major. It's just that we're looking for the connection. We're looking for the links. We're looking for the threads. And that's the part that we have been looking for all along. We're getting well into the process, and we're hoping that we can still discern those connections and those links to a very key aspect, and that is significance and integrity. And I just wanted to underscore and reiterate that it does extend beyond individual structures. And that's the part that I'm looking for the connection.
Okay, we'll certainly look into that. We may have another meeting with you and with IES in regards to that.
Yep, appreciate that.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next. We're going to run out of time here. Worried. So Jeremy Klopp, Farron Piers from Farron Piers is going to talk a little bit about our transportation and mobility recommendations. Jeremy, take it away.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate everyone's time today, and I will go through just 4 slides here so I can be brief, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at the mobility and access section of the plan. A few highlights here, just because I think the connectivity and the layers of connectivity to the surrounding networks, transit, but especially roadway as well, is a big organizing element, along with the network design in terms of the block structure on site and sort of the connectivity into the site. So key points here on the vehicular side, we are looking at 3 signalized intersections along Jefferson and 2 right in, right out type intersections to really distribute trips across that edge and maximize the connectivity into the site. We're also looking at multiple connections into the site to ensure that the edges of the site remain open to access from surrounding neighborhoods and Grand Prairie in particular, looking at a new connection to Skyline Road on the southwest portion of the site, as well as Hardy Road, and multimodal enhancements to the Lake Crest Drive access point as well. And the intent here is that we can provide those connections so that the amenities on the site, the commercial, the retail, the loop trail, all of these things are available and accessible to the surrounding communities, and also allow us to distribute the demand for access to that site across multiple access points. There may also be opportunities on the eastern edge for future connections. So we've thought about the network in ways that would connect there potentially. And those are shown as possible connections. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about on-site connectivity. Really, a few organizing elements for the networks here. One primary one is a transit spine, a center running transit cross section that we've envisioned to penetrate deep into the site. And we've been coordinating closely with DART and talking with them about things like their density thresholds for BRT and LRT, potentially long-term extension in the Jefferson corridor. And the amount of development, both on the residential side and on the commercial side here, exceeds their thresholds for density, such that we're really confident about the long-term transit organization of the site being a positive element there. We're envisioning about 3 stations, as you can see on the map there, shown in the white balls, with spacing to ensure that 10-minute walk to transit from the vast majority of the site. We're also organizing things in such a way that this low-speed network of trails and separated facilities support access throughout the site, whether it's to the school site we talked about or some of the other amenities and commercial opportunities on the site. The idea there is really designing a network and a set of cross sections that allow younger folks, children, maybe less experienced cyclists, older folks, to move comfortably and safely without fear of high-speed collisions, and really minimizing that worry and concern by designing roadways to deliver those operating speeds that we want and really minimize the need for enforcement. Some of that complete streets design is really pivoting off of Dallas's new design manual along those lines and reflecting a lot of that vision. That's been a really helpful resource, and really trying to ensure that walkability and compact design. We've also in the plan shown a couple locations for mobility hubs. I'm not going to show those here, but really thinking about opportunities to consolidate parking and share parking such that we're minimizing the need for on-site and internal circulation. We're also at densities here on the site and a mix of residential and commercial that we are expecting to capture a lot of the demand on site, so that internal capture and minimizing the need to travel off-site for as many daily needs as possible will really also help with some of the trip generation comparisons. The next couple slides really just show what that looks like. A couple renderings here. This is a rendering of the central transit spine and multimodal corridor. You can see generous walkways and separated bike facilities there, along with the vehicular side and a sense of the scale. One of the real benefits of the center running transit spine, and you'll see this in some of the park block cross sections in the plan as well, is the opportunity for central shade and vegetation in the center of the cross section. And so these multiple rows of trees and shade and comfort along the way really enhance some of those separation aspects, but also provide a tree canopy opportunity here that some other street designs might not. Next slide here is really an example of how those transit stations can be well integrated. We're envisioning BRT levels of service here with highly amenitized stations, real-time information, shorter crossing stretches to and from this facility, and really breaks up the roadway cross-section in positive ways for access. It also allows us to sort of dynamically manage the curb edge for parking in terms of pickup drop-off activity and thinking about the different aspects across the site where we might want to manage the curb adjacent parking differently. So you'll see that in a number of our cross sections. And there's also a section in the plan about emerging mobility and sort of the goods movement, pickup drop-off aspects there as well. So I'll keep it tight there and transition to the discussion. We'd love to hear your feedback about how close we are to hitting the mark perfectly, or what else we could be doing to modify and improve this section.
Thank you, Jeremy, for keeping it brief. If there's anything you'd like to add while we're voting, that would be great.
Thanks, MK.
Got our first couple of voters in here, looking pretty strong. It's good. It's good to hear that. We love to hear that the work we've been putting in is recognized and appreciated, but that doesn't mean there's not still work to do. So be honest with us, tell us your comments, and we'll see what we can do to meet them.
I also see a comment from Kay Shelton in the chat that overall we're hitting the mark, but they've got some markups that they'd like to send over about specific cross sections. So we're looking forward to getting those.
Great. And I see a hand up from Joe as well.
Yes. Hello, Joe Clemens from DART. Kay, Sean, and I are representing DART today, but we will have comments on the PDF document available tomorrow. I think that's what your deadline was, but I just want to state that we do like the spine, the transit spine that runs through the site. I know there were different variations being considered, in the scenarios. We do have some comments about phasing. As you may know, we have a GoLink zone, the Mountain Creek GoLink zone now that reaches the site. So we're suggesting local bus extension in the future, the Jefferson bus route, as development occurs. And then as you get closer to higher, some development end densities, whenever that you reach that point, then possible BRT. Really like the BRT design, particularly those images you just showed. You actually have visualized it for us, because we talk about a BRT in the future, but we don't have any design concepts for it. So we're going to be looking at that in the next year or so. So we'll consider those concepts you have, particularly with the stations, the highly amenitized station areas. Lastly, LRT is a very longer term stretch goal. Our 2045 system plan was just adopted, and it doesn't have any LRT extensions at this time. But I do want to point out that the cross section of the transit spine should be designed, the width of it should be designed for LRT. If that's the ultimate goal long term, whether that's 20 years, 40 years, because you don't want to build you don't want to have that the cross section built too small for that. And I know Mueller had, down in Austin had some design issues. Originally wanted to do LRT and BRT, and so I know it's getting BRT light right now, but it looks like you're planning for dedicated BRT through this site.
Right. So Joe, if you have an opportunity to look at our cross sections and make comments on those, that would be appreciated.
Will do. Great overall design, the images, pedestrian orientation, the density levels, the mixed uses, all that's very in line with our TOD guidelines. So just want to applaud you on that. And one last thing, the mobility hubs, we believe you define them with transit, and that's how we define them in our 2045 system plan. So we believe they should be on this transit spine itself. And I know they're offset by, I believe, about 2 blocks.
Yeah, just to that point, I think we would consider the stations themselves to have characteristics of the hubs, as well as those additional mobility hubs. So I think it comes down a little bit to what sort of space we allocate at the curb to some of those other mobility hub services you might connect to. Maybe there's plenty of room for e-bike parking and a bike station kind of thing. Maybe it's not as desirable to have 5 spaces for EV car share, as an example, right at the station. We'd rather have people walk a block or that sort of thing. So we can talk about those details as we get further along too, but that's part of the thinking in that both and. Thanks for those comments. Really appreciate that, Joe.
I see the question here about the industrial uses to the north may transition away, talking about how the intersections on the north of the site match up with the grid north of the train tracks. Right now, the only roadway that crosses the rail tracks is Baghdad. And we are proposing a 4-way intersection with Baghdad. There is a possibility in the future that MacArthur could fly over or under the tracks and connect to the site. We did not include that as part of this plan, however. Fair and Piers ran a traffic analysis, and we feel like we are distributing the traffic fairly evenly. And Jeremy, I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, we haven't got to the step of regional travel demand forecasting and detailed signalized intersection operations analysis, but the work that we have done to look at sort of destination strength and activities west of the site in Arlington, north around DFW and to downtown, we're estimating somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of the trips to and from the site on the vehicular side heading to and from Jefferson, and that the distribution, because there are destinations strong to the west and east, would be heavier toward the east. And that's really our sort of highest capacity sort of location that we were looking at. And so far, everything looks to be working at that sort of lane per hour calc that we've done on Jefferson with those 3 intersections. But the lefts into the site and the lefts out of the site, you can imagine if we concentrate those onto just one signalized intersection, we expect that's going to have some challenges. That's part of the reason we're talking about multiple signalized full movement locations. And the details on those will still need to be examined further in the next phase.
Okay.
We did have another question from Catherine Rush. I accidentally lowered her hand.
Her hand was up.
I promise we haven't forgotten you.
Please, Catherine.
Oh, hi. So this is also kind of for DART because it could impact my comments, but the kind of question was, if the idea that the transit spine is intended for BRT and potentially LRT in the future, do the curves create an issue?
Oh, the curves.
Yeah.
The curves in the road.
Yeah, Catherine, I would say they would. I do think BRT is more appropriate here, and I wouldn't really see light rail coming into the site. You know, if it's more of a regional thing, it might stay outside, right? Yeah, I think that's a good thing to bring up.
Okay, because it's not ideal either from like a transportation safety visibility perspective, if it's intended to be kind of a more major street with a lot of different things going on it. But I think the bigger issue would be the question about transit. And if it is intended for LRT in the future, if that we do want to make that an option, I think curves are discouraged, correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, we're working on a light rail system here in Austin, and the criteria, curves are an issue. Absolutely. Stations have to be straight. They cannot be on a curve, and they have to be 400 feet long if it's a 3-car train with additional transitions on either side. So we're hopeful that we could make this suitable for both BRT and LRT, but we'll look at that issue more specifically with our engineers.
Okay, another question that was for DART, and this might not really be that big of an issue, but I was just wondering if the station location made sense, or would it be a missed opportunity not being closer to the kind of, I think, the western business section, or from, you know, a transit perspective, if that kind of commercial mixed use is just as demand generating as like a major employer. And that's kind of a question for DART.
I guess I'm not that familiar with the site plan in terms of where the stations are located. Everything I haven't really focused in on that. The stations could probably move around, right? Depending on what's ultimately there.
Well, if I was looking at that myself, and you have one in the mixed use district up by the Anchor area, and you do have those. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know the distance between stations, but they look possibly about a half-mile between stations, which is appropriate. Right. Yep. And then you have those distribution, those all user streets, which are the commerce streets. So, you know, even the first station up by that mixed use district looks about right, particularly because you're going to be distributing through the site with those low speed streets. Yeah, I mean, we really want mixed uses and destinations as well as the residents. So I think the stations the locations look appropriate.
Thanks for that, Joe. I think I want to get to Gail's section here too, but I will say too, I think the structured and concentrated parking and the mix of uses are likely in the locations where we have them to generate off-peak ridership as well. So not just sort of the inbound and outbound employment heavy ridership patterns, but also off-peak ridership throughout the day too. So the more we can centrally locate those, and that half-mile walk or that 10-minute walk does incorporate almost all of the purple that you see there from that northernmost station. So, but appreciate that comment, and we can definitely share more details on that.
Yeah, one last comment, that the purple is the anchor use, correct?
Yes.
There may be an opportunity. I mean, this thing can change. You may have a corporate interested anchor that comes in and wants to have a station closer to Jefferson, so that may be possible to pull back or add another station in there.
Sure.
It really depends on that corporate user and whether they want direct access. But as you know, sometimes corporate users don't want a bus stop next to them. So.
All right. Well, thank you for those comments. I'm going to let Gail Vittori talk a little bit about the sustainability policies of the plan and the utilities.
All right, thanks, Jim, and hi, everyone. So many of the ideas that are put forward in the Sustainability Forward concept have been threaded through many of the parts of this presentation that you've already heard, but really the big idea is to establish Hensley Field as a living laboratory for resilience and a proof of concept for the city's comprehensive environmental and climate action plan. So that really is the overarching structure that these recommendations are prompted by. So firstly, we have the goal to achieve a minimum of gold certification for LEED for cities and communities. This aligns with City of Dallas requirements now as we understand them for LEED certification for buildings. And so using LEED as a structure and LEED cities and communities specifically for a project of this scale seems to be very appropriate. A preliminary assessment put us very comfortably in gold certification range with a potential to achieve platinum, which is the highest level in the LEED certification framework. We've also established a goal to achieve net zero energy for all new construction. This also is specifically tied to the CCAP goals, and to take advantage of low carbon and healthy materials for all new construction. Many of you might know that embodied carbon is becoming a very, very hot topic right now, just because it represents such a significant part of overall carbon emissions. And to marry that with those materials also being healthy, we think is very much aligned with the guiding principles of this project. Next, we have the establishment of an innovation village, which has been referenced in many of the earlier slides. Would be located a 40-acre site on the Runway Peninsula, and to make the economics of this work, do it in partnership with a nonprofit or corporate sponsor. And this would serve as a demonstration project really to advance more of the, say, state-of-the-art technologies that are available, to test them, to monitor, to learn from them, also to really explore emerging building technologies that may be more appropriate on a smaller scale than for Hensley Field as a whole. Many of the items that are required in the LEED for Cities and Communities certification are not specifically identified here, like heat island and light pollution reduction, but one of them also is recycling and composting. It's a requirement to achieve LEED for Cities and Communities certification. Dallas has an aggressive zero waste goal by 2040. And so requiring recycling and composting throughout Hensley Field is a recommendation that exceeds what is currently offered in the city of Dallas, but we think would be also an important advancement to use as a demonstration potentially for Hensley Field. And then finally, we have the identified the environmental, social, and governance criteria to use as a basis for selection of one or more of the corporate or institutional anchor users. ESG criteria, many of you may know, is increasingly becoming a benchmark for good business. And we think that that is also very aligned with the overall guiding principles. Next, now with a more specific focus on utilities. And just to note that the recommendations we've recognized need to balance practical and implementable with aspirational goals for the project. So we need to keep that in mind as we're advancing. And I think it especially holds true for the utilities. So the project calls for relying on a 20-inch City of Dallas water transmission line on Jefferson Street for the majority of the development, with the southern portion being served by Grand Prairie. There's also, on the ambitious side, the construction of a parallel reclaimed water system for non-potable uses like irrigation and toilet flushing throughout the project, and developing also a requirement for buildings to be reclaimed water ready so that they are ready to accept that non-potable water. This would need to be done in careful coordination with the city because currently there's not a reclaimed water source. So we need to really see how to manage that to make this be a viable opportunity for the project. The construction of a 30-inch wastewater trunk line to the TRA treatment plant that's 3.4 miles northeast of the site when the existing line is out of capacity. The employment of blue-green infrastructure to capture and treat 100% of the first flush of stormwater. Leah talked about this in her earlier slides. And that I think has many benefits, including not burdening downstream neighbors from the stormwater runoff from the project. And then finally, to coordinate with Encore or another utility provider to explore the commercial viability of district energy with geothermal cooling for the entire development or portions of it. It's something that might be appropriate to initially test with the Innovation Village as a microgrid, but certainly based on the financial evaluation, it is going to need a significant partner to support that. This is a graphic showing the Innovation Village, what that might look like. I know our minutes are short, so we might just go on to the Mentimeter. Look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Gail. I think someone was asking MK for the QR code to be put back on the screen.
Absolutely. Here's the QR code, or you go to menti.com and type in this code. Either will take you right to where we are in the presentation.
Okay.
And as we start to populate our answers, I'd love if someone could address Marty's question about LEED and sustainable forward designs. What incentives have we anticipated to foster these kinds of LEED rated structures?
I don't know that we've talked specifically about incentives. We've been talking about requirements. A lot of these, what we found in other projects is a lot of these requirements do not add significant costs. There are costs, there are commissioning costs and such, but it hasn't shown to be a deal breaker. We did study certain elements that were deal breakers. For instance, we studied the idea of doing a full geothermal system along the whole site for the whole property. And it was determined that we really could not support it all by ourselves. That was what Gail had. But anyone who has ideas about the kinds of incentives that you have in mind, that would be good.
Yeah, and I would just say when we did the preliminary assessment for LEED cities and communities that showed us comfortably in the gold range, I think we did that with a sense of not setting a bar so high that it was going to require significant added costs than what we would otherwise be including in our overall recommendations. So I think because of just the starting place for this project, we found that it's matching up very nicely with what the requirements are for achieving LEED for cities and communities, with the exception of something like, as I said, recycling and composting, not currently provided citywide. That would need to be implemented on a citywide or on a district-wide basis for Hensley Field to be able to align with that prerequisite in LEED for cities and communities. So there are a few things like that, but I think overall we found things matching up very nicely.
any specific questions? I see Marty's questions. Susan.
And for Susan's comment about certifiable versus certified, that's always something that can be evaluated. It may be because of cost sensitivity to certify versus be certifiable. I would just note that for projects, in my experience, that are not pursuing full certification, certifiable sometimes leads to not really following all the way through. And so I think we can certainly be sensitive to anything that begins to identify a significant added cost. But my general sense is probably that's not going to be a significant barrier for this project.
Okay. So we have only 5 to 6 minutes left, and I hope people can stay on a little longer. Our last section is going to talk about money and implementation. And if you're at all interested in that, it'd be important for you to be part of this. Let me just start by talking about the phasing for the project. I think Jana mentioned early on about the need to relocate Texas Army National Guard. What we mean by that is primarily the helicopter operation because of the noise that operation creates. So the first phase is really concentrated on the very northern portions of the site so that it would be beyond the noise contours of the helicopter operation. So in the first 5 years, we see that the development of the northern site could happen in tandem with the Texas National Guard operations. The second 5 years, you see the development proceeding across the new alignment of Cottonwood Creek. And the third final 10 years would be the remainder of the project. So basically phasing the project from northeast to southwest to allow for the phase out of the Texas military operations. And a part of the whole phasing is the Navy's responsibility to clean up the site to residential standards. Their agreement with the city requires them to do that in a way that does not impede redevelopment. So that's generally the phasing strategy. I'm going to let Dan Guimond from EPS talk a little bit about the cost of development and the potential revenues.
Thanks, Jim. So the project team, Stantec, SWA, and McCann put together all of the horizontal infrastructure costs on the project, infrastructure and public amenities. Over the course of the 20-year development program, we have total costs of about $390 million and total revenues of about $353 million, which in aggregate is a financing gap of about $37 million, which for a project of this size and magnitude is a very manageable number, at least in aggregate. However, the deficit or funding gap is very much front-loaded. Over the first 10 years of the project, there is an estimated gap of $99 million in years 1 through 10, basically what we're calling phases 1 and 2, with the positive revenue starting to generate after that period of time with a positive cash flow of $61 million over the second 10 years of the project between years 11 and year 20 in terms of our estimates. As I said, the cumulative deficit is about $37 million, which in terms of a net present value of it is really about double that. There was the discussion about the sustainability forward elements, which are in aggregate only about 7% of the costs of the project, $29 million over the $390 million. But they are also a portion of the deficit because the sustainability forward elements aren't generally covered by current land values and development, supportable development values. Next slide, Jim. So what we would be looking at in terms of addressing that financing gap would be starting with, and very typically on these redevelopment projects, using tax increment financing. And in Texas and Dallas, that would be implemented through a tax incentive reinvestment zone, or TRs, to fund these infrastructure and public amenities and benefits in the project. That basically, TIF basically allows you to use the incremental tax revenues from the project and reinvest it back in the project. Based on other redevelopment efforts that have been done by the city of Dallas, the TIF is generally ranged from 75% of the city's taxes in the project to 90%, and 55% of the county's taxes to 75%. So using those as kind of a low scenario and a high scenario, we've estimated that TIF could, over the 20 years, generate between 198 and 243 million in revenues over the course of the project. Of course, in terms of getting those revenues up front in any kind of bonding, it would be the net present value would be the more relevant number, which ranges between 100 and 123 million. One potential strategy that has come up in the discussions with the city is to explore the opportunity of Hensley Field becoming a sub-district of the Cypress Waters TIF district. Cypress Waters is another very similar redevelopment project on a lake, and they will be paying off some bonds by 2025, and will have excess TIF revenues that could potentially be transferred or used on the Hensley Field site, either for some of our upfront infrastructure costs, or potentially also to fund some of the affordable housing elements of the project, as was previously discussed. Other financing tools that we would expect a master developer to use in these projects would be a variety of different special districts that share the cost burden of the project with the future tenants of the project, particularly municipal management districts or public improvement districts. So that's fairly typical for a large-scale redevelopment of this type. And then specifically, as we're talking about the sustainability forward elements of the project, we will be pursuing a range of environmental and energy grants that can help fund that portion of the project. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at EPS, Jim Musbach, who's going to talk about the governance aspects of governance component of the implementation plan.
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. Given the scale and diversity of uses in this site, we would recommend that the city engage with a master developer partner and to engage them under a master development agreement that defines their responsibilities for the implementation of the project over the years. And what the developer would bring to this is, one, the ability to secure private capital and to work with city agencies and others to develop a public-private financing structure incorporating some of the things that Dan just described. They also would be responsible for executing the horizontal development, the infrastructure, site preparation, parks and things of that nature, and then managing either the sale of land for development by other third-party developers, the vertical development, or doing some of it themselves, and often there's a mix of those things. And you can see on the right side of this slide are just examples of similar scale projects where this has been done very successfully. This developer would be selected through a competitive RFP process normally. You're looking for, an alignment of capabilities and sensibilities, really, for a partner that you can have a lasting, productive relationship, for the implementation of the project. And once a preferred developer is selected, the city would enter into an exclusive negotiation agreement to undertake the detailed negotiations of the business terms of a master development agreement. We believe that there would be so this question was asked earlier about whether there'd be a single quarterback on this project. And, there's always roles to play for various entities within the city, but you don't want to burden too many people in the city on the implications. And a lot of that happens in the way the master development agreement is crafted so that the city's goals are embedded in that and can be implemented by the developer. But we would imagine that there would be a dedicated multi-departmental staff team to negotiate and implement the plan. And, I think that's still a question of exactly how that would get structured within the city. But no doubt the economic development department would be integral to this in some fashion.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just going to briefly describe, we've worked with the city on the potential zoning strategy for the site. Because of the scale of the site, we're talking about it being a planned development district, PDD, with specific standards for each of the sub areas, sub districts, and the neighborhoods within the area. We're also proposing that a detailed set of standards and guidelines be prepared to expand on the more general PDD regulations, and that they would be administered by a joint city master developer design review board, and that the coordination of all new construction would occur between this design review board and the city. So before a project could get approved by the city, it would have to go through this design review process with the city developer design review board. This is just to make sure that the goals of the master plan get carried forward, and also that there's a level of flexibility. We don't want to have to be going to city council every 6 months to get revisions to the plan. So the zoning, fairly general, the design standards and guidelines, fairly specific. And with that, we're going to get you to vote on the policies related to these implementation, the implementation policies related to phasing, financing, governance, and entitlements. I appreciate your patience in staying on beyond the 90 minutes that we had designated.
I see we do have a comment in the chat from Susan Alvarez. Jim, if you want to address that.
Power over Ethernet talk. Okay. I can't speak specifically to that, but if somebody else can, or Susan, if you want to expand on that idea, power over Ethernet technologies.
Sorry, I'm struggling with it's a relatively new technology where your whole building is basically powered over Ethernet. It requires a lot less wiring. You don't have the electrical losses from going between AC to DC power. And your overall building energy use is much lower. And so it may be something to explore as part of the design of future industrial, institutional, or commercial buildings.
And you're referring to the Sinclair Hotel in Fort Worth?
Uh-huh.
Okay, we'll look at that. Okay, how did the voting turn out here, MK? I noticed that there were some concerns or some relative concerns, again, on implementation, some misstatements or inaccuracies that might need to be addressed. If anybody wants to expand on that.
Don't be shy. You voted anonymously, but we need your help.
Yeah, and I know the next slide is going to say this, but we really are looking for if anyone finds that there are statements in the plan that are inaccurate or misleading, we really do want you to identify those for us before we do a public draft. The additional design guidelines are a great idea, but there should be a by right mechanism that allows administrative review approval for projects in compliance with the guidelines. Individual design review slows projects. Yeah, I think that is kind of the intent, is to write the design guidelines in a way that gives a level of certainty to the applicant, so they're not being put through an arbitrary or subjective process. Would the master developer RFP process include a low-income housing developer as part of the selection criteria? I'm not sure that, I mean, typically a master developer would be responsible for horizontal development and managing the affordable housing components. So not clear whether the master developer would bring that on as part of their team, or whether they would need to just demonstrate the ability to manage an affordable housing program. Encourage use of a request for expressions of interest as the vehicle to receive and negotiate with proposals. I'm not quite sure what that comment means. It might mean that as an initial step before you go into a request for qualifications. Sometimes these processes include, developer forums where you bring interested parties together, either virtually or in reality, to describe the project and to collect questions. That's something that might be considered by the city.
It might be worth noting, Jim, that the city has already issued a request for interest for institutional uses, corporate uses for the employment site on the campus.
Right, which is a little different than the master developer solicitation, which will.
Correct.
Right.
Jim, this is Kevin.
Hey, Kevin.
Maybe Arturo might comment here, but it might be worth noting also that REIs and RFIs tend to scare off the real developers because they don't want to show their hand. So it's a lot of times in our experience, it's a waste of time.
Yeah, and we found something of the same with developer forums. You can bring all of them to the same room, but they're very reluctant to share information or even ask questions sometimes. So yeah.
And I would just add one reason to do an RFP. We oftentimes call them requests for business plans, because we're trying to get developers to actually put down a proposal that has a financial component to it that's kind of a starting point for negotiations. Requests for interest are, I think the comments that were already made kind of cover that, but it doesn't get you to the point where you're at a really good starting point for negotiating a business deal.
In the interest of time, I'm going to move forward, but we have instructions on how to continue submitting comments.
Yes. So Arturo, maybe you want to close this off.
Yes, of course. And thank you all. We're nearing the end of the Hensley Field Master Plan timeline, but there are additional steps that we need to take to get there. This slide is showing some of those briefings, meetings, and presentations we'll be making as we ramp up to the adoption process. You'll also notice that we're working towards a public draft release on the 11th of March on the project's website. So as we mentioned today, if you can get our comments or your comments back to us tomorrow, that will give us enough time to make those changes and have it ready for the 11th unveiling publicly. And we are having a stakeholder advisory group meeting similar to today's on March 15th. So with that, I want to thank you all for staying and hanging in with us today. Again, thank you for your time throughout today and the entire process. And if you think of anything else or have additional questions, comments, you can please email me and I'll make sure that those get sent to the right folks and get incorporated into the plan, or at least answered. And back to you, Jim, to close out.
Thank you, everybody. That was really helpful. We're going to make sure that the chat gets documented so that we get all of these comments down. And please reach out to us if you have any questions. And again, provide Arturo with any comments you might have on the actual plan document, because we want to make sure that it reflects all of your comments, questions.
I see Cindy has asked for a copy of the presentation. We'll send that out with additional resources to kind of post-op follow the meeting. Thank you all so much for your time and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
So.
Bye.